am without bread and cannot get any. My children will starve, or if they do not, they must freeze. We have no wood, neither can we get any. Pray come home. An American soldier's wife.
By 1780, America was in the 5th year of its war for independence, and tens of thousands of families were torn apart. Women were running farms and shops alone. Children were growing up without their fathers. Farms had been ravaged, livestock and crops had gone to feed the armies, and the currency of the land was almost worthless. 5 years after it was issued, a continental dollar was worth about a penny. In Philadelphia, beef cost 15 times what it had a year before. An ordinary horse sold for $20,000. A wagon load of money, wrote George Washington, will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provision. Some Americans, however, were benefiting from the war. Profiteering was rampant. The hero of Saratoga, Benedict Arnold, used public wagons to transport his private stockpile of imported goods to market. He was accused of closing down rival shops, forcing people to buy his goods. Even members of Congress stood accused of lining their pockets.
If I were called upon to draw a picture of the times and of men, I should say that idleness, dissipation, extravagance seems to have laid hold of most of them. An insatiable thirst for riches seems to have got the better of every order of men. George Washington.
There sets in a period, a whole era of the revolution, in which it seems as though there is not going to be a future. The American people are suffering cruelly from want and from despair, and they are weary of this war. This is a situation in which many people are saying, how could we have been so foolish as ever to have believed that we could have taken on and licked the most powerful empire in the world?
America's war weariness was mirrored in England. The ordinary Englishman had never been for the war in the first place. To make matters worse, the war was doubling Britain's debts and wrecking her economy. To end the war, the King's ministers put forward a promising new plan, taking the American South. Savannah, Georgia had already fallen to the British the year before. American loyalists assured the Crown that unlike troublesome New England, the South was teeming with subjects ready to take up arms for the King.
The British government believed that the American Revolution was the work of a small group of malcontents, largely located in New England, and that on the whole, the American populace was loyal to the Crown.
But the Crown had failed to defeat the revolution in New England and the Middle Colonies. Now victory depended on taking the South. In New York, British General Henry Clinton recognized the magnitude of his mission.
I felt the tottering ground on which I stood. This is the most important hour Britain ever knew. If we lose, we shall never see such another.
Clinton sailed with 100 ships and 8,500 men. His objective was the largest and wealthiest city south of Philadelphia, the jewel of the South, Charleston. Perched on a peninsula, Charleston easily could be cut off. Against Clinton's impressive force, the American general Benjamin Lincoln had only half as many men. The British began digging in for a siege. After 19 days, trapped by the Royal Army and blockaded by the Royal Navy, Lincoln called a council of war to discuss a withdrawal. The city fathers were vehemently opposed.
Some declared to General Lincoln that if he attempted to withdraw the troops, they would cut up his boats and open the gates to the enemies. This put a stop to all thoughts of an evacuation. General William Moultrie.
On May 9th, a furious cannonade would erupt between the two armies. Mortar shells crossed and exploded long into the night. General Moultrie observed it appeared as if the stars were falling to the earth. The constant pounding took its toll.
Fatigue was so great that, for want of sleep, many faces were so swelled that they could scarcely see out of their eyes. William Moultrie.
3 days later, surrounded and cut off from help, Lincoln finally surrendered. Clinton's terms were humiliating.
Lincoln is told, "You will be denied the honors of war." He cannot march out with his flags flying and his drums beating. This is an important thing in 18th century military behavior.
At 11 o'clock in the morning of May 12th, the Continentals laid down their muskets. Charleston was the worst rebel defeat of the Revolution. 5,466 Americans, including General Lincoln, became prisoners of war. It was America's largest surrender to a foreign army until the fall of Bataan in World War II.
The soldiers captured at Charleston were crowded into prison ships and other loathsome quarters. Nearly 1/3 died. Their hardships were not alleviated by civilities from their conquerors. Dr. David Ramsey.
Get back here!
During the Revolution, 18,000 Americans were taken prisoner. Almost half died. To survive, men fought each other for rotten morsels. From their hair and rags, they picked lice and vermin and ate them. Rats were a delicacy. Scurvy, smallpox, and yellow fever were epidemic.
The foul atmosphere and sickening heat, the shrieks and wailings of the wounded, the struggles and groans of the dying, altogether formed a combination of horrors which no pen can describe. Thomas String.
In the end, more patriots died in British prisons than on American battlefields. By 1780, the Americans had taken more than 9,000 prisoners, but they lacked the experience, the jails, and the manpower to hold them. Many simply wandered away. The rebels' treatment of loyalists was a different matter.
In Kingston, New York, Loyalist prisoners were entombed, in essence, in a subterranean cellar underneath the building where the Provincial Congress of New York met. It was so overcrowded and it was so filthy that the smell rose through the floors and permeated the meeting room in which the Provincial Congress was meeting.
The stench was so terrible that a resolution was passed permitting congressmen to smoke. As the resolution read, for the preservation of their health.
Charleston has fallen. I fear the whole country goes with it. For having nothing but a few discontented militia to depend on, we shall never be in any condition to check the ravages of a merciless enemy. John Matthews, Continental Congress.
After capturing Charleston, General Henry Clinton returned to his headquarters in New York. His second-in-command, Charles Lord Cornwallis, remained behind to roll up the rest of the South. In May of 1780, he was on the move in South Carolina when he learned that a small rebel force was 10 days' march away. Encumbered by his army, Cornwallis knew he could never catch up to the rebels. So he sent an ambitious 27-year-old lieutenant colonel in pursuit.
Bannister Tarleton, who was this young buck. He was one of these kind of flashy Errol Flynn characters you always get in warfare. And he was only good up to a certain point because he was so hot-blooded, he got himself into trouble.
Tarleton and his men covered 105 miles in 54 hours. On May 29th, they caught Colonel Abraham Buford's column of 300 Virginians on flat ground with no cover.
Tarleton, his infantry and cavalry advanced to the charge with the horrid yells of infuriated demons. Buford ordered a flag to be hoisted, expecting the treatment sanctioned by civilized warfare. This was no part of Tarleton's creed. Dr. Robert Brownfield.
When an American raised a white flag, Tarleton personally cut him down. In the end, not one rebel was left standing. For Tarleton's deeds that day, the red-haired firebrand became a British hero. But in America, his name became synonymous with barbarity. The term Tarleton's Quarter came to mean, take no prisoners. To replace the men lost at Charleston, a new American army was marching south with a new commander, General Horatio Gates. Washington opposed the choice. Gates was more an administrator than a fighter. Congress hailed Gates as the victor of Saratoga and gave him the command.
Gates arrived in July in South Carolina to encounter troops that were already in terrible condition, hungry, and many of them ill, and announced, much to the surprise of the officers and the dismay of the soldiers, that he intended to take them on a march almost immediately.
For his first Southern offensive, Gates targeted Camden, South Carolina. Held, he was told, by only 700 men. Against all advice, he ordered the march by the shortest route, straight through barren country.
To the men's complaints and queries, he responded reassuringly that, in fact, there would be supplies, rations, rum along the route. There wasn't. They were so desperate and so hungry that they took hair powder that was used for their hair and mixed it in to thicken the stew that was made out of stringy beef, green corn, and hair powder.
Sick and underfed, the troops took 2 weeks to cover 120 miles. The night before the attack, Gates treated his men to rations of molasses in place of the rum he had promised but didn't have. Among the already weakened troops, the molasses caused crippling diarrhea. When Lord Cornwallis heard of Gates' approach, he marched his army north to confront the rebels. On August 15th, the two armies collided in the night. The next morning, before the fighting resumed, Gates deployed the unseasoned militia on his left and center. And on the right, the veteran Delaware and Maryland Brigade, under the Bavarian volunteer Johann de Kalb.
He is, like Washington, a physically commanding guy. He's a big man, and he's got bravery out the kazoo. This guy is afraid of nothing. De Kalb gets here, and Washington immediately recognizes this man is a real soldier. He's got a good head about him. He's an excellent commander, and his troops really like him. So de Kalb is given command of the Maryland Division, and he turns it into a crack fighting force.
But Gates didn't send in de Kalb's veterans. Instead, he dispatched the inexperienced militia. The British seized the moment.
The impetuosity with which they advanced, firing and huzzaing, threw the militia into such a panic that they threw down their loaded arms and fled. A great majority without firing a shot. Colonel Otto Williams.
I confess, I was amongst the first that fled. Cause I cannot tell, except everyone I saw was about to do the same. It was instantaneous. There's no effort to rally, no encouragement to fight. Officers and men joined in the flight. I threw away my gun. An American militiaman.
Within minutes, 2,500 men, 4/5 of the American army, ran away. Only one militia regiment and de Kalb's Maryland and Delaware veterans stayed on the field. With a valiant counterattack, they drove the British back until Cornwallis turned his entire force upon them. Outnumbered more than 3-1, de Kalb continued the fight. First with bayonets, then hand-to-hand.
So de Kalb leads his division from the front. It's a follow-me type of leadership. I'll ask you to do nothing I'm not prepared to do first myself. He stands and fights, and he refuses to surrender. Wounded multiple times, and then he's bayoneted to death.
De Kalb's men now fled with the rest of the army, chased by Tarleton's cavalry. He hounded the rebels for 22 miles and quit only when his horses were exhausted. When the militiamen ran from the field, General Gates rode past them, all the way out of the state, and kept on going. He never fought another battle.
What do you think of this great man? Was there ever an instance of a general running away, as Gates has done, from his whole army? 180 miles in 3 days and a half. It does admirable credit to a man at his time of life. Alexander Hamilton.
In 3 months, America had lost 2 armies and suffered 2 of its worst defeats. hopes of Southern rebels would now depend on a different kind of soldier, waging a different kind of war. The private armies of a handful of charismatic leaders, the mysterious men known as the partisans. After the British triumphs at Charleston and Camden, the British strategy of winning the war from the south up seemed invincible. In the summer of 1780, hundreds of loyalists flocked to the British lines to enlist. They were even joined by some of their former enemies, nervous patriots ready to return their allegiance to the crown. Even a former president of the Continental Congress switched sides. Georgia now had more men willing to fight for George III than for George Washington. General Cornwallis held the southeastern coast from Savannah to Charleston. With no American army left in the South, Cornwallis confidently moved inland to set up a chain of forts.
The British, as they move further and further north, getting away from Charleston, getting away from Savannah, they create what are called lines of communications, these long supply lines. Now, you can get food locally, but you can't get ammunition locally. You can't get all those other things that armies need to function. So supply trains have to be organized, convoys have to be run. Once you do that, you've created a target. And that's what the Americans will do. They'll go after those targets, the soft things, the depots, the convoys, those small outposts, and they'll try to bleed the British to death that way.
The greatest threat to British supply lines came from the bands of guerrilla fighters called partisans. One of their most aggressive leaders was the wealthy planter Thomas Sumter. At the news of Charleston's fall, he rode off to fight the British. Hours later, Banastre Tarleton burned his plantation to the ground. Sumter raised his own guerrilla army and fought more than a dozen battles against the British and Loyalists. The fierce partisan was known as the Carolina Gamecock.
He was not over-scrupulous as a soldier. Enchanted with the splendor of victory, he would wade through torrents of blood to achieve it. Colonel Henry Lee.
When British-born lawyer William Davey heard of Charleston's surrender, he immediately left his practice and sold his considerable estate in North Carolina to fund his own guerrilla army. At Charlotte, with only 150 men, Davey fought General Cornwallis and his entire army to a virtual standstill. The tall and elegant Davey was said to have killed more men with his sword than any other American officer in the Revolution. The most unlikely partisan leader was Francis Marion.
He was 48 years old when he finally got a chance to really show his stuff. He wasn't a military man by background, and he had congenital problems with his knees and his ankles. He didn't even look like he was physically capable of being an officer running around in the field.
For 8 months, the survival of the revolution in South Carolina largely depended on Francis Marion and his phantom army. Marion had grown up hunting in the woods and swamps. He knew the value of silence, decoy, and ambush, He'd ride 60 miles in one night to make a surprise attack and then melt away before daylight.
Marion never encamped over 2 nights in one place, unless at a safe distance from the enemy. He generally commenced the march about sunset, advancing through the sable curtains of the night, unobserved. Captain Tarleton Brown.
He led only a small band of men at any one time, some white, some black, and all of them poor, with makeshift arms ranging from ancient muskets to short swords made from saws. Always the commander, Marion himself never fought. His sword was even rusted into its scabbard. But his troops bled the British without mercy. Cornwallis became so desperate to stop him that he finally sent Banastre Tarleton to hunt him down. After tracking Marion through 26 miles of swamp, even the indomitable Tarleton gave up.
Come, my boys, let us go back. As for this damned old fox, the devil himself could not catch him.
The epithet caught on. Francis Marion became known as the Swamp Fox. In the end, partisan leaders like Marion reinvented American warfare.
They came along and they took advantage of the geography and the tactics, and they knew that controlling territory was not as important as getting at your enemy and getting at him in a way that you could really hurt him. And it became a model for future wars.
In 1780, most of the battles in the South were fought between Americans, rebel versus loyalist, brother against brother. Simmering resentments boiled over into full-fledged civil war.
Such scenes of devastation, bloodshed and deliberate murder I never was a witness to before. The two opposite principles have set the people of this country to cutting each other's throats.
Neighbor was against neighbor. Father against son. And son against father. And he that would not thrust his own blade through his brother's heart was called villain.
The Civil War builds up because of the intensity of the passions, and it will start getting away from the soldiers and start getting into the hands of the locals. And this is where you get into Hatfield and McCoy type situations. It becomes personal. They're not fighting about king and country anymore. They're not fighting about ideals about liberty. This is revenge. You shot my brother, I'll shoot your brother.
Southern loyalists had years of patriot oppression to avenge. For refusing to renounce the king, they had been fined and jailed. Their property had been confiscated. They'd been executed. Newspapers had even printed recipes for the proper method of tarring and feathering loyalists.
First, strip a person naked. Then heat the tar until it is thin. Pour it upon the naked flesh. Sprinkle with as many feathers as will stick to it. Then hold a lighted candle to the feathers.
Now, with the British behind them, the Loyalists were eager to settle old scores. Their vengeance was described by the rebel governor of South Carolina, John Rutledge.
The enemy have burnt a prodigious number of houses and turned a vast many women, with their children, almost naked into the woods. They seemed determined to break every man's spirit.
The year 1780 in the South and North alike would be remembered as the dark days.
He who increases his wealth in such times as the present must be an enemy to his country, be his pretensions what they may. Congressman William Whipple.
Since Benedict Arnold had come to Philadelphia as military commandant, the hero of Saratoga had turned his talents to increasing his wealth.
Benedict Arnold is, I think, in the Revolution, one of the most amazingly interesting figures because he reflected, I think, most profoundly what you might call the split soul of the American population at that time. He was totally dedicated to in his commitment to the revolutionary cause, but had a boundless ambition for the honor and the acclaim that comes with war, and perhaps the riches as well.
Arnold had been a wealthy man when he left Connecticut to fight the British 5 years before. He always insisted on fine uniforms for himself and his men. He personally advanced money to pay for his expeditions, and Congress never repaid him. As commandant, he lavishly entertained the highest society in Philadelphia and fell in love with one of its most celebrated beauties, Peggy Shippen, the charming daughter of a loyalist judge. At 39, Arnold was nearly twice her age. He cut a dashing figure and had a gallant reputation, but he had little else to offer. His left leg was so badly injured from war wounds that he had to lean on an orderly during his wedding. His soldier's salary paid little. To support the couple's extravagant lifestyle, Arnold began to speculate in goods made scarce by the war: sugar, textiles, tea. In the spring of 1779, the state of Pennsylvania formally charged him with using his position to profiteer. Congress convicted Arnold on a lesser charge of abusing the public trust and ordered the commander-in-chief to reprimand him. Months later, Washington, his old friend and mentor, reluctantly sent the letter. Arnold wrote a hot-tempered reply.
Having made every sacrifice of fortune and blood, and become a cripple in the service of my country, I little expected to meet the ungrateful returns I have received from my countrymen. Benedict Arnold.
But Arnold was guilty of all the charges against him and more. The same week he sent his indignant letter to Washington, he began to negotiate with the enemy. Bypassed for promotion, contemptuous of Congress, and deeply in debt, Arnold had decided to turn his coat. His go-between with the British was the commander-in-chief's personal adjutant. Major John Andre was an elegant young officer, a gifted artist, and a poet. He was also an old suitor of Peggy Shippen Arnold.
Peggy Shippen maintains good relations with her boyfriend, John Andre, and through her good offices, Andre and Arnold are put into direct touch with each other and to begin to negotiate to deliver this key new fortification that Washington has been constructing since 1777 at West Point and prepare to surrender it to the British.
West Point commanded the Hudson River, a key defensive line for the colonies. For the British, it seemed the key to finally dividing and conquering America. Arnold had asked to be put in charge of West Point. Washington granted the request. For the delivery of the fortress, Arnold asked for a general's commission in the British Army. He also demanded the lavish sum of 10,000 pounds sterling, 200 times more than a laborer earned in a year. On the night of September 21st, Arnold and Major Andre rendezvoused in a forest on the banks of the Hudson. Arnold gave Andre the plans of West Point and signed a pass that would allow him to travel through American lines. Disguised in civilian clothes, Major Andre was making his way back to New York City when he was waylaid by 3 militiamen bent on robbing him. They discovered the fort's plans hidden in his boot. Word of the spy's capture was sent to the American commander, Benedict Arnold. That morning, Arnold also learned that he had a house guest arriving. General George Washington was coming to tour his prized stronghold at West Point on that very day. When he arrived, Washington was offended that his host wasn't there to greet him. That afternoon, the commander-in-chief read the day's messages.
My God, Arnold has gone over to the British. Whom can we trust?
Benedict's wife, Peggy, who I think was probably the brains of the operation, because I think she was a lot smarter than Benedict was, covers his retreat by feigning a seizure, allowing her nightgown to strategically come open at the right moment to discombobulate Washington and the rest of the command group into, oh my God, and they give her time to collect herself.
Peggy Arnold's hysterics convinced the commander-in-chief that at least she was innocent of treason. By then, her husband, the man Washington once looked on as a son, had already reached safe haven aboard a British warship, the Vulture. Major Andre was left to face Washington's wrath alone. He calmly admitted to being a spy, but refused to name his accomplice.
He is tried in New Jersey. He is condemned to die as a spy. Since he was caught in civilian clothes, much to his disgust, that death is to be by hanging, and he is a person of somewhat aristocratic upbringing. He believes that hanging is the death of a common criminal, and that honorable soldiers die by execution, by being shot.
With the words, "It will be but a momentary pang," the 29-year-old Andre tied his own blindfold and slipped the noose over his own head. He was then offered a last word.
He raised the handkerchief from his eyes and said, "I pray you to bear me witness that I meet my fate like a brave man." The wagon removed from under him, he was suspended and instantly expired. The spot was consecrated by the tears of thousands. Dr. James Thatcher.
Most Americans believed the wrong man had been executed, that Andre had paid with his life for Arnold's treason. The British had tried to bribe other generals, John Sullivan, Ethan Allen, Daniel Morgan. Not one had turned. Benedict Arnold, hero of Quebec, of Ticonderoga, of Saratoga, became the most hated man in America.
When Arnold betrays America, the reaction within the Army is extremely venomous, and it's one of those wild mood swings that you can only understand if you know how deeply he was admired.
Within 2 months, Benedict Arnold was wearing the uniform of a British general. Less than a year after his treason, he would lead a raid against New London, Connecticut, just 12 miles from his boyhood home. By 1780, half of Americans were neither patriot nor loyalist. They were known as trimmers, drifting to whichever side the winds of war might blow them. Into this sea of vacillation plunged one of Cornwallis's most dependable commanders. Major Patrick Bulldog Ferguson was determined to recruit every fence-sitter in the Carolinas.
If you wish to be robbed, murdered, and see your wives and daughters abused by the dregs of mankind, say so at once, and let your women turn their backs on you and look for real men to protect them.
Major Ferguson, the same marksman who spared George Washington at the Battle of Brandywine, inflamed the countryside with tales of rebel atrocities. He soon gathered 1,100 men, all of them American. His loyalists, dressed in bright red, learned the bayonet and prepared to fight their neighbors to the death. Ferguson threw down a gauntlet to the rebels across the Blue Ridge Mountains. Unless they put down their arms, he would march his army over the mountains, hang their leaders, and, as he put it, lay their country waste with fire and sword.
The word gets out through the rumor mill that Ferguson is going to come out and attack the over-the-mountain settlements. This rumor produces an instantaneous reaction amongst the over-mountain men. We won't let him come to us, we'll go get him. Everybody jumps on their horses, grabs their rifles, and off they head, organizing as they go along, drawing in people from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina.
On October 6th, Ferguson chose to make a stand on a heavily wooded hill in North Carolina called Kings Mountain. There, he defied God Almighty and all the rebels out of hell to overcome him. The next day, those rebels arrived, nearly 1,000 hunters and farmers carrying their long rifles. The men were dead shots with their famous frontier weapons, to which they gave names like Hot Lead and Sweet Lips. Smoothly and silently, the rebels moved into position. By the time Ferguson's pickets spotted them, they had the mountains surrounded. A rebel colonel yelled, "Here they are, boys, shout like hell and fight like devils." The riflemen took cover and filled the air with their bullets.
I recollect I stood behind one tree and fired until the bark was nearly all knocked off. One fella shaved me pretty close, for his bullet took a piece out of my own gun stock. Thomas Young, 16 years old.
The Loyalists soon discovered the disadvantage of holding the high ground. Their bullets were sailing over the heads of their targets. Ferguson's position was hopeless. Still, he rode up and down, shouting that he would never surrender to such banditti. Whenever a man tried to raise a white flag, he cut it down. At last, an hour into the battle, even Ferguson saw he was finished. He signaled a few of his officers to follow him in an escape. But a local boy had alerted the rebels that Ferguson, the only British soldier on the field, was wearing a plaid shirt to hide his uniform.
It appeared that almost 50 rifles must have been leveled at him. 7 rifle balls passed through his body. Both of his arms were broken, and his hat and clothing were literally shot to pieces. Private James P. Collins.
Ferguson's second in command called for quarter. The chilling reply was Tarleton's quarter, shouted by rebels who remembered the massacre of their kinsmen under a white flag. Some of the other backwoodsmen didn't know a white flag meant surrender and kept on shooting. At the end of the day, 700 Loyalists were taken prisoner. More than 150 lay dead. An equal number were so badly wounded they were left where they fell. By then it was too dark to descend the mountain. Captors and captives shared a sleepless night.
The situation of the poor Tories appeared to be pitiable. The dead lay in heaps on all sides, while the groans of the wounded were heard in every direction. I could not help turning away from the scene before me with horror, and could not refrain from shedding tears. Private James Collins.
The next day, Loyalist families began arriving at Kings Mountain to look for their men. Many of those still alive were past help. Many who were dead had hardly been buried.
It was badly done. They were thrown into convenient piles and covered with old logs, yet not so as to secure them from becoming a prey to the beasts of the forest or the vultures of the air. Private James P. Collins.
As the news of Kings Mountain spread, Southern Tories began to lay down their guns.
It was no longer safe to be a Loyalist on the frontiers. They became dejected and timid. The Loyalist was no longer safe to sleep in his own house. He hid himself in the swamps. Loyalist Colonel Robert Gray.
1780, a year that began with despair for the rebels, had ended with a glimmer of hope. The British stranglehold on the South was weakening. Despite inflation, treason, and Charleston, the Patriots' worst defeat of the war, the Revolution was still alive. Before the next year would end, the fate of America would be decided in a showdown near a quiet Virginia settlement called Yorktown.
It is with inexpressible pain that I inform Your Excellency of the mutiny which took place in the Pennsylvania line last evening. Every possible exertion was made to suppress it, but the torrent was too potent to be stemmed. General Anthony Wayne.
On New Year's Day, 1781, the Pennsylvania Continentals, a full quarter of Washington's army, finally lost faith. They had not been paid in 12 months, yet their government was offering $81 in cash to recruit convicts willing to trade a jail cell for an army jacket. As night fell in Morristown, New Jersey, 1,500 soldiers seized artillery, gunpowder, and cannonballs and filed out of camp. They intended to march to Philadelphia and lay their grievances directly before the Pennsylvania State Council and the Congress. 2 officers who tried to stop them were wounded. A third was killed. word of the mutiny reached the British in New York. The commander, General Henry Clinton, immediately dispatched a loyalist named John Mason to tempt the mutineers with amnesty and money if they would switch sides. At least one British general was confident they would betray their revolution.
This event will be attended with happy consequences. We anxiously wait in expectation of hearing that the malcontents have joined His Majesty's army in New York. Benedict Arnold.
But these rebels were mutineers, not traitors. Defection, once called turning coat, was now known as turning Arnold. The soldiers arrested Mason and his guide. 3 days later, both men were convicted as spies and hanged from a tree by a horse's collar. On January 6th, officials from Congress and the state of Pennsylvania arrived to hear the mutineers' complaints. The soldiers claimed they had enlisted for 3 years and their term was up. The officials insisted they had signed on for the duration of the war. After 2 days of negotiation, the soldiers won their point. More than 1,300 men were given the right to re-enlist or leave as they saw fit. Most re-enlisted. Just as the mutiny seemed at an end, 200 New Jersey Continentals marched out of their camp.
Now, for George Washington, this is intolerable. A pattern is starting to show up here. He's not going to tolerate that. So he just absolutely drops the hammer on that. He sends 2 divisions down, they surround them, they crush the mutiny. I mean, the guys never have a chance to even really articulate their demands before they're surrounded. The sergeants who were the, quote, ringleaders are identified. 3 are picked by lot, and the rest of the ringleaders are told, you're the firing squad. They make their fellow sergeants shoot their own friends.
Being themselves guilty, they were greatly distressed with the duty imposed upon them. And when ordered to load, some of them shed tears. The wretched victims, overwhelmed by the terrors of death, had neither time nor power to implore mercy and forgiveness of their God. Dr. James Thatcher.
While George Washington was wrestling with mutinies, a fleet bearing 1,200 British troops sailed into the Chesapeake Bay to raid Virginia. In command, in his first action as a British general, was Benedict Arnold. Virginia's governor, Thomas Jefferson, due to what he later called fatal inattention, waited 3 days before calling out the militia. Time enough for Arnold to sail up the James River to within 30 miles of the capital, Richmond. Driving his soldiers overnight through a rainstorm, Arnold arrived to find the city defended by a scant 200 men, who promptly fled. He asked a local citizen what the Virginians would do if they ever caught the great Benedict Arnold. The rebel replied they'd cut off his left leg, the one wounded at Quebec and Saratoga, and bury it with full military honors. The rest of him, they would hang. In 1781, General Washington was entering his 3rd year of stalemate against the British in New York. Both sides were dug in for defense, but neither had the strength to attack. For Washington, the period of watching and waiting was the hardest struggle he had endured. Finally, after a year of treason, mutiny, and deadlock, Washington received good news. Congress agreed to name his favorite general commander of the Southern Army. From the first day he met Nathanael Greene in 1775, Washington had liked the Quaker who renounced pacifism to fight for the Revolution.
Nathanael Greene had no military experience prior to the Revolution. He was a man who stood about 5 feet 10 inches tall, somewhat stocky build, blue-gray eyes, a man who walked with a slight limp. But despite the fact that he had little experience and was not initially impressive, within a year or so, Greene did begin to impress others. And Washington himself, later in the war, said that he hoped if something happened to him, that Greene would be his successor.
Greene had served beside Washington at Trenton, Brandywine, Germantown, and Monmouth. As quartermaster at Valley Forge, he had kept thousands of men from starving. Now he faced his greatest challenge, retaking the South. From West Point, Greene confided to his wife, Kitty.
My dearest angel, what I have been dreading has come to pass. His Excellency, General Washington, by order of Congress, has appointed me to command the Southern Army. I have been pleasing myself with the agreeable prospect of spending the winter here with you. How unfriendly is war to happiness?
When Nathanael Greene arrived at Charlotte, North Carolina to take command of the so-called Grand Army of the Southern Department of the United States of America, he found only 1,500 men. It was, Greene reported, but the shadow of an army in the midst of distress, wretched beyond description. Barely half the men were properly clothed or equipped, and when Greene arrived, they had exactly 3 days' supply of food. For every sorry scarecrow Greene could muster, Lord Cornwallis had 3 well-fed regulars. Greene responded to his predicament with the most daring strategy of the Revolution. Already outnumbered 3-1, he decided to split his force.
Right about? Hey!
By the books, this was suicide. But Greene believed the gamble would save his army. He sent the frontier general Daniel Morgan west with 600 men, while he went east with the rest of the army.
It makes the most of my inferior force, for it compels my adversary to divide his. He cannot leave Morgan behind him in order to come at me. And he cannot chase Morgan far while I am here with the whole country open before me. I am in no danger. Nathanael Greene.
Greene was relying on hidden allies, phantom bands of guerrilla soldiers fighting in the Carolina swamps.
The magic he realized is the British can't concentrate to beat him up without exposing their whole backside to being ripped apart by a relatively small force that can work with Marion, can work with Sumter, can work with Pickens to rip things up in the rear. That means he can do things that, quote, aren't by the book. So Greene's thing is, I will fight where I can when the conditions are favorable to me. I won't fight if the conditions aren't favorable.
When Cornwallis learned that Greene had split his pathetic force, he didn't believe it. But he took the bait and split his army. On New Year's Day, 1781, he sent Tarleton and 1,000 men to find Daniel Morgan and crush him. Morgan was near the Broad River in South Carolina when an express rider brought word from General Greene.
Colonel Tarleton is said to be on his way to pay you a visit. I doubt not, but he will have a decent reception.
For several days, Morgan let Tarleton pursue him. Then he turned and made his stand at a place called the Cowpens. It was a sparsely wooded pasture. It looked like the worst possible place for foot soldiers to take on cavalrymen. Cowpens also backed up against the Broad River, leaving his men no retreat. But Morgan had chosen this trap on purpose. Almost half his men were raw militia, likely to run at the first pop of a gun. As Morgan observed, men fight as much as they find necessary, and no more. When men are forced to fight, they will sell their lives dearly.
Dan Morgan invented a new way to teach how to fight to militiamen, and it was to know who could do what, and then never ask a man to do more than he was physically capable of doing. So the night before the Battle of Cowpens, Morgan made the rounds of all the campfires, told each unit, this is exactly what I want you to do, and I don't expect you to stand and fight, militiaman. It's okay after you've shot your 2 rounds to run away.
Night came upon us, and General Morgan went amongst the soldiers, encouraging them and telling them, just hold up your heads, boys, he would say. And when you return to your homes, how the old folks will bless you and the girls kiss you for your gallant conduct. Private Thomas Young.
The next morning, an hour before daylight, scouts reported that the British were just 5 miles away and closing fast. Morgan formed his men in 3 lines, 150 sharpshooters in front, the militia in the middle, and behind them, 450 steadfast Continentals. The riflemen fired first. Then the militia fired their 2 volleys as ordered and withdrew. Mistaking their withdrawal for a retreat, Tarleton ordered a charge and slammed straight into the line of Continentals. When the American line stood fast, Tarleton sent in his Highlanders. Now the Continentals fell back. Tarleton, seeing another apparent retreat, pursued. Suddenly, at a deadly range, the entire American line turned and fired.
It was for a time, pop, 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 and then a whole volley. But when the regulars fired, it seemed like one sheet of flame from right to left. Oh, it was beautiful. Thomas Young.
The Americans just blew Tarleton away. And that's the reason Cowpens is such a great tactical and strategic victory for the Americans, because one of the few times in the war you can actually see that the Americans effectively used the linear tactics and beat the British at their own game.
Dan Morgan, in the space of about 35 or 40 minutes, just delivered, after Washington's victory at Trenton the second most decisive battlefield defeat on the British of the Revolution. He has smashed an elite British force, totally crippled them.
Morgan captured or killed more than 800 men, 90% of Tarleton's force. In England, politician Horace Walpole, a rebel sympathizer, received the news with a typically wry remark.
America is once more not quite ready to be conquered, although every now and then we fancy it is. Tarleton is defeated. Lord Cornwallis is checked. And Arnold, not sure of having betrayed his friends to much purpose.
Two days after Daniel Morgan's victory at Cowpens, Cornwallis ordered his army on the march. He expected Morgan to be moving slowly, savoring his victory. Cornwallis planned to intercept him near Cowpens on the only road leading to the main American army. But Morgan had already put 100 miles behind him and was rejoining Nathanael Greene. Cornwallis was now more determined than ever to chase down the rebels. But weighed down by the baggage of a formal field army, he was moving too slowly. To convert his army into fast-moving light troops, he spent 2 days burning every expendable item.
Without baggage, necessaries, or provisions in the most barren, unhealthy part of North America, with zeal only, it was resolved to follow Greene's army to the end of the world. General Charles O'Hara.
When Nathanael Greene heard that Cornwallis was pursuing him, he confounded his officers by exclaiming, "Then he is ours."
Greene says, okay, I'm not going to try to stand and fight. I'm going to start backing up. And I'm going to get Cornwallis trying to catch me. And I'm going to let him waste all his energy. So Greene starts marching back towards the North Carolina-Virginia border, the Dan River.
Greene instructed a Polish volunteer, engineer Tadeusz Kosciuszko, to map the fords of every major river between the American army and the Dan, and to commandeer every boat he could find. For the men of both armies, the 4-week race to the Dan was as grueling as any march in the war. 200 miles in rain and snow, on red clay roads that were icy by night and muddy by day. Hundreds of rebel soldiers marched without shoes. Their feet left bloody tracks on the roads. Toward the end, some men were allowed to rest only 6 hours every 2 days. On St. Valentine's Night, 1781, the first Americans reached the Dan. Kosciuszko was waiting with the boats. At midnight, Cornwallis's horsemen raced up to the south shore just in time to see the last boat in the region, landing the last Americans on the far bank. Although not a single Continental remained south of Virginia, the drive to expel them had left the British Army destitute, just as Greene intended. Cornwallis had burned all his provisions and raced his men 200 miles for nothing. Cornwallis turned back to rest his army. 10 days later, Greene recrossed the Dan and followed him. For 3 weeks, one army shadowed the other, Cornwallis seeking battle, and Greene avoiding it while he waited for reinforcements. In early March, they arrived. Now, with 4,000 men, he outnumbered the British for the first time. On March 14, 1781, Greene stopped running. He chose a strong position at Guilford Courthouse, only 12 miles from his enemy's camp, and waited. The next morning, Cornwallis roused his troops before breakfast and marched on Guilford Courthouse. He had only half as many men as Greene, but they were seasoned veterans, and he was eager for battle. Half of Greene's men were untested militia, and he deployed them in the same formation Daniel Morgan used to win cowpens.
You have a great number of militia. If they fight, you beat Cornwallis. If not, he will beat you. Put the militia in the center with some picked troops in their rear with orders to shoot down the first man that runs. Daniel Morgan.
At 1:30, the British attacked. The first line of militia had barely fired a shot when they saw the British come on with fixed bayonets.
To our infinite distress and mortification, the North Carolina militia took flight. Throwing away arms, knapsacks, and even canteens, they rushed like a torrent headlong through the woods. Colonel Henry Lee.
The first line breaks and runs too quickly, but the second line, which is composed of the Virginia militia under the command of ex-Continentals with a lot of Continental veterans, stands and fights in place for nearly an hour.
The British and Americans collided in a deadly battle of attrition. Outnumbered and getting the worst of the fight, Cornwallis resorted to the unthinkable. He ordered his artillery to fire at the Americans over the heads of his own men, knowing full well some of the shells would fall short.
Cornwallis, out of desperation, facing total defeat, shoots down a large chunk of his own force.
It was a drastic measure, but it worked. The Americans abandoned the field. Cornwallis claimed the victory, but at a terrible price. 500 casualties, 1/4 of his army. In England, politician Horace Walpole summed up the entire campaign from the Dan River to Guilford Courthouse.
Cornwallis has conquered his troops out of shoes and provisions, and himself out of troops.
Six weeks after conquering the Carolinas, Cornwallis abandoned them for the safety and provisions of Virginia.
It's an interesting contrast, I think, between Cornwallis and General Nathaniel Greene on the American side, his chief opponent for much of the war in the South. Greene was, in fact, able to lose most of the battles he fought and yet succeed in winning the campaigns. Cornwallis's epitaph perhaps would be that he won the battles but failed to win the campaigns.
3 days after Guilford Courthouse and 6 years after joining the war, Nathaniel Greene wrote with despair to his wife in Rhode Island.
My dear, we have had a very severe action with Lord Cornwallis. Nothing but blood slaughter prevails here. I should be happy on a farm with my family about me. God grant the day may not be far distant, when peace, with all her blessings, shall diffuse joy through America.
General George Washington had spent more than 2.5 years deadlocked with the British at New York. The commander-in-chief had been waiting for the great promise of the Franco-American alliance to bear fruit. The French had delivered an army, but no navy, and he knew that until he had ships to match England's, there would be no harvest of victory. At last, in the spring of 1781, the influential French commander in America, General de Rochambeau, arranged the gift Washington longed for. 30 warships under the Admiral Comte de Grasse were sailing from the West Indies for America. But there were 2 conditions. First, the fleet could be spared from the Caribbean for only 2 months in early fall, the hurricane season. Second, de Grasse would not risk his ships in the rough waters and shallow harbor of New York. Washington abandoned his plans to retake New York and concentrated on a more promising target: the 8,000-man army of Lord Cornwallis, now at Yorktown, Virginia. The calm waters of the Chesapeake Bay would be agreeable to Admiral de Grasse. On August 19th, French and American troops marched away from New York. The Allied army had 400 miles to cover to rendezvous with the French fleet. But there had been no word of the fleet since it left the West Indies. "I am distressed beyond expression," wrote Washington, "to know what has become of the Count de Grasse." Unbeknownst to the American commander-in-chief, de Grasse was already in the Chesapeake. He had driven off a British fleet and now controlled the bay. Cornwallis was trapped. He could no longer escape by sea, and his exit by land was blocked by the approaching armies of Rochambeau and Washington. On October 6th, Washington personally broke ground for the largest siege that had ever occurred on American soil. By October 9th, the fortifications were complete. Washington himself would light the first cannon.
The day that the batteries were opened, the signal was to be the hoisting of the American flag. About noon, the much-wished-for signal went up. I confess I felt a secret pride swell my heart when I saw the star-spangled banner waving majestically in the very faces of our adversaries. Sergeant Joseph Plum Martin.
The Allies fired a shell every minute, around the clock. Cornwallis himself was forced to abandon his headquarters for a bunker underground. By mid-October, the only obstacles between the Americans and victory were 2 fortifications, redoubts number 9 and 10. Washington decided to storm them under the cover of night. On October 14th, a French battalion moved on number 9, while 400 Americans under 24-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton crept toward redoubt number 10. To ensure that no accidental firing would alert the British, his men left their muskets unloaded. The Americans would fight this battle with the weapon they once feared most, the bayonet. One of the Americans wounded at Redoubt 10 would receive a new medal for his valor. It was called the Purple Heart.
There's no question that the greatest tactical moment in the siege of Yorktown comes in the capture of redoubts 9 and 10. For one thing, it's the culminating moment. When those redoubts fall, Cornwallis's defense is literally doomed. He can't hold out anymore.
On October 15th, his ammunition exhausted and his defenses in ruins, Cornwallis wrote to General Clinton in New York.
My situation now becomes very critical. We shall soon be exposed to an assault in ruined works, in a bad position. I cannot recommend endeavoring to save us.
Two days later, a drummer boy mounted the parapet, beating a parley. He could not be heard over the thunder of cannon, but he could be seen. The guns fell silent. Then a British officer appeared, waving a white handkerchief. The nearest American officer blindfolded him and took him to Washington's headquarters. Cornwallis requested a 24-hour ceasefire to negotiate surrender. Among his terms, he asked that his vanquished army be paroled to Britain. Washington refused. Thousands of Americans captured at Charleston after the humiliating surrender were still rotting away in British prisons. Washington demanded unconditional surrender. Within hours, Cornwallis submitted. On October 19th, more than 7,000 British and Germans sullenly trudged onto the field of surrender.
The British in general behaved like boys who'd been whipped at school. Some bit their lips, some pouted, others cried.
Cornwallis did not attend the surrender ceremony because he was too humiliated by it. And his troops, as they marched out, with very poor grace, flung their guns down upon the heap as though they wished to shatter them. It was not a dignified scene for an army.
Cornwallis's second-in-command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara, approached Rochambeau, carrying the sword of surrender. But the French general indicated George Washington. Washington deferred to his own second-in-command, Benjamin Lincoln, the general Cornwallis humiliated at Charleston. Lincoln accepted the sword, ceremonially handed it back, and announced the surrender. George Washington proudly sent formal notice to Philadelphia.
I have the honor to inform Congress that a reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected.
The Marquis de Lafayette put it more simply. The play, sir, is over. When word of the surrender at Yorktown reached London, the Prime Minister, Lord North, took the news as if he'd been shot. "Oh, God," he cried, "it is all over." King George was more practical.
When men are a little recovered from the shock, they will then find the necessity of carrying on the war.
Both men were right.
Yorktown, in effect, brought the Anglo-American aspect of the war to an end. The British, quite simply, lost the will to carry on contesting for the American colonies. They had to divert resources to fighting the French and the Spanish and the Dutch.
The struggle in America was virtually over, but England fought on to preserve the rest of her empire. Battles raged from Honduras to Gibraltar, from Guadeloupe to Ceylon. 8 years after the war began on Lexington Green, the final shot of the American Revolution was fired 11,000 miles away at Cuddalore, India. In the World War, the British were victorious.
George III's reign, for better or for worse, was one of the most successful reigns in British history. There was only, in a sense, one failure in that reign, and that was that the attempt to suppress the colonial revolution did not succeed.
By the summer of 1783, Benjamin Franklin had been negotiating peace terms with England for more than a year. Before the talks ended, nearly 100,000 American loyalists would become exiles. No longer welcome among their neighbors, they left behind their houses, their homeland, and their American dreams, and sailed for Nova Scotia, or the West Indies, or England.
The Loyalists, there is about them a kind of poignant, absolute sense that they had done nothing wrong. They did not understand why they had become victims of this great tragedy.
On September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Peace between the world's greatest power and a nation of farmers was at last signed in Paris.
This was the first time a third world country in modern terms had made a successful revolution against a great empire. The basic agenda for the world's people from that time until this very day is not only the freedom of Americans, but the freedom of all peoples in third world countries who are oppressed or exploited by first world empires.
On December 4th, 1783, from New York Harbor, the last British ship left the United States of America. Blocks away in a hushed room at Fraunce's Tavern, George Washington bade farewell to his officers.
With a heart full of love and gratitude, I now take leave of you. I devoutly wish that your latter days may be as prosperous and happy as your former ones have been glorious and honorable. I cannot come to each of you, but shall feel obliged if you will come and take me by the hand.
Some of the men in that room had served with Washington for 8 years. through Valley Forge and Morristown, Brandywine and Monmouth, through mutiny, starvation, and near defeat. Henry Knox was the first to approach the general. Washington began to take his hand, but was overcome with emotion. He threw his arms around his old friend and embraced him. One by one, every officer took his leave in the same tearful way. No one spoke a word.
Such a scene of sorrow I have never before witnessed. The thought that we were then about to part from the man under whose conduct the glory and independence of our country had been achieved, and that we should see his face no more, seemed to me utterly insupportable. Colonel Benjamin Talmadge.
Henry Knox succeeded George Washington as Commander-in-Chief and went on to become the nation's first Secretary of War. Supporting his troops through the Revolution left Nathaniel Greene in debt. After selling off his home in Rhode Island, the hero of the South was given a plantation by the grateful state of Georgia. He died there 1 year later at 44 of heat stroke. Thomas Paine, whose fiery words sparked a revolution, became too radical even for America. He died at 72, impoverished, alcoholic, and forgotten. After the Revolution, King George III suffered from bouts of insanity, but ruled successfully for another 28 years. He lived long enough to see his son fight another war with America in 1812, with no better luck. Charles, Lord Cornwallis, was cleared of blame for the disaster of Yorktown and went on to become Governor General of the jewel of the British Crown, India. Britain never embraced the traitor Benedict Arnold. He died in England a broken and outcast man. 4 of his sons became officers in the British Army. At 82, Benjamin Franklin went on to lobby for America's Constitution, even though he opposed many of its principles, including the notion of a presidency. The Marquis de Lafayette returned to France to lead his own country's revolution. He drafted what became the preamble to the French Constitution. In it, he paid tribute to the ideals so eloquently written by Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, whose most immortal words were, "All men are created equal," could not bring himself to free any but 5 of his 150 slaves, even on his deathbed. Jefferson and John Adams died on the same day, July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence. After 8 years of service to his country, Joseph Plum Martin became destitute and had to rely on a veteran's pension of $8 a month to support his family. After his death at the age of 89, his hometown placed a marker at his grave with the simple epitaph, "A soldier of the Revolution." By war's end, no American was more revered than George Washington. His only dream was to go home to his beloved Mount Vernon and retire from public life forever. Many doubted he would. No general since the days of Rome had relinquished so much power, so hard won.
Washington was careful always to present himself as a man of peace, reluctantly driven to the sword. And in his portraits, he was careful to have himself depicted as one whose sword was in his left hand. If your sword is in your right hand, that means you're ready to unsheath it.
At noon on December 23, 1783, the commander-in-chief presented himself to Congress. With a trembling voice, he resigned the commission he had faithfully upheld through the long war. George Washington, citizen farmer, finally rode home in time to celebrate Christmas, just as he had promised Martha 8 winters before. In 1799, at the age of 67, the man who would be called the father of his country died childless. Yet to the world, he left an immortal legacy. The citizens of America, he wrote, are now possessed of absolute freedom and independency. They are, from this period, to be considered as the actors on a most conspicuous theater, which seems designated by Providence for the display of human greatness. A signer of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, reminded his countrymen that their journey had just begun. The American war is over, he said, but this is far from the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed.